So shall we start? Well, hello everyone. My name is Katya Kartseva. I'm associate professor here in the International University in Moscow, and I will lecture you Russian arts and culture. Well, I know that you are planning to visit Tretьяков State Gallery and Kremlin museums, so you will be introduced to classical Russian art and culture, but my course is mostly about contemporary art and contemporary culture. Because I think that contemporary art, in my opinion, is a great source of information about who are contemporary Russians. So who are we nowadays? Not in the past, not 100 years ago, but just right now. And I think that contemporary art is a very great source for that, because I think you won't deny that every great art, every great artist, they always depict their time and they make a portrait of a generation and the image of the epoch and so on and so forth. That's why I think that that's why I think it's important if you want to know the Russian lifestyles, the way we behave, what we are afraid of and what we are dreaming of, and so on. So it can tell a lot of stories. There can be found a lot of stories inside contemporary art. We will go through several periods. We will start from the 70s and 80s. Then tomorrow we will talk about the 90s. And on Wednesday we will talk about 2000s and 2010s. Well, I realized that 70s and 80s is quite far from now. And actually it happened 30 or 40 years ago. But it is still important to talk about it and to mention it, because most of our prominent and significant artists, they actually started their careers in the 70s and in the 80s. And even those ones who started their careers in the 90s, they were actually very much prepared by these previous generations of artists. So that's why it's important to talk about it. We'll mostly talk about unofficial art, of course, because these are the roots about all the further processes that are happening now in contemporary Russian art and culture. So let's start with the 70s and 80s. First of all, I need to give you a few sketches what was life like in the 70s and in the 80s in USSR. Some art historians, and we actually call this a Brezhnevian stagnation. Brezhnev is the name of the person who was in charge and who was a ruler at those times. At the same time, this was the rise of unofficial art. Well, first of all, let's try to imagine what was life like at those times. Well, imagine that on TV there were constantly broadcasts about meetings of the Communist Party, and there were all these numerous congresses accompanied by long applause and flashed by the same faces of the party leaders. So Brezhnev was in charge for a quite long period of time. So only victories were announced, but people, of course, they realized that actually in real life, in the era of stagnation, things are quite the opposite, and that it's not just like it's being said from the media and from elsewhere. And that's why the air was full of political anecdotes and that were ridiculing those same leaders of the party from the screens. So I Googled yesterday just in the internet anecdotes and jokes about the Brezhnevian epoch. There were hundreds of anecdotes about it, so the whole population realized that actually what is happening in reality has nothing to do with those declared from the media. The population was also surrounded by official art productions. There were exhibition reportings on the victories of socialist construction, socialist posters about the victory of communism. Everywhere there were, like nowadays, advertising. Well, you know that since 1930s, social realism had been chosen as the only method in art, and avant-garde art and any manifestations of unofficial art, they were prohibited and they were forbidden. Well, I need to mention that I don't want to say that Soviet art was a completely bad phenomenon, because in fact there were great artists like Alexander Dayneko, Arkady Plastov, Viktor Popkov, Tair Salakhov, Geli Korzhev, and many others who were really great artists within the Soviet system. But in fact, in the 70s and in the 80s, this system was no longer efficient. So it was inefficient in producing real art. So Maybe they were producing great drawers, but I think you won't agree that being a great drawer doesn't mean being a great artist. So we will talk mostly about unofficial art today. And this surplus, I mean this overproduction of propaganda, it caused that unofficial artists started to work with it and to play with it. And at the same time, they started working with the duality and this irony of the time, and it found its expression in their art. Here, by the way, we have an image just of a typical Soviet realism painting. And so the first movement in art that I would like to talk about is Sots-art. Probably you've heard something about it. In fact, it's a Soviet version of pop art. Well, pop art you're all aware of. So if pop art, it was overproduction of things, overproduction of design, of mass culture in the United States, and it was sort of dominance of consumption, fetishism. Sots-art, it was overproduction of ideology in USSR. And artists, they work with the dominance of Soviet propaganda and myth-making. So here are just a few examples. So it was the same language, but it talked about some different things. And the inventors of Sots-art, these are Alexander Komar and Vitaly Komar and Alexander Melamid, excuse me. So in 1967, after graduating Stroganov Art College, they both were teaching at school as teachers, and at the same time, from time to time, they worked as designers. You know that in the USSR, the activity of the artist was often about making wall newspapers, writing slogans, preparing props for Soviet demonstrations, and so on. And once in the summer of 1972, artists drew up a pioneer camp near Moscow, and there they had an idea of creating a series of paintings on the theme Sots-art. And in 1972, they wrote the manifest of Sots-art. Well, what's good is that all these artists, they are still living now, and there are lots of interviews where we can find their own opinion and their own memories about what was happening. And in one of such interviews, I found like Komar and Melamid talk about the invention of Sots-art. So that's what they are saying. When Vadik Poperny saw the first works of Sots-art, when he came to our studio in 1972, he said, "Wow, it's Soviet pop art. We've all been waiting for this for such a long time." He understood in this sense that it's not advertising of consumer goods, but advertising of ideology, Soviet pop art. So Sots-art, it means socialist art, but in fact, this is not political art or reaction to politics. This is a combination of socialist realism with pop art. It arose as a parody on official Soviet art and images of Soviet mass culture. So Soviet ideology was also sort of mass culture. And one of the first works that they had done was this badge. We can see it on the right, where they put their own portraits, but in the style of a Soviet badge with Lenin and Stalin. So it was very standard badge, and every pioneer had it. And they made an analog of this badge, but with their own portraits. And they wrote famous artists of the 1970s, Komar and Melamid artwork. The next work that we need to mention is this "Forward to the Victory of Communism" slogan. Actually, it was the standard slogan that was everywhere, on the streets, in the public places, in schools, in the factories, everywhere, like just nowadays advertising. In fact, they just appropriate the slogan and they only write down their surnames. In fact, what was it about? So these slogans, they were everywhere, but no one actually had an idea what is communism, where forward, what it means, because this slogan, it lost its meaning because the population had no idea where are we going to and what communism are they talking about. And in fact, Komar and Melamid, they appropriate the slogan, which could be found everywhere, as an element of mass culture, since this slogan no longer has any meaning. And later on, the impassive withdrawal of the text, the work with the Soviet text, will be perceived by the School of Moscow conceptualism, so they will continue working with the text. So that's just another example. Probably you've also are aware of this poster. Have you ever seen it? It's just like, don't talk, the enemies are listening. But Komar and Melamid, they draw it as a painting, but they reduce the text. And since there is no text, there can be any meaning of this painting, right? What this guy means, what in fact is happening there. There can be any kind of interpretation, not just as the Soviet propaganda been thinking about. So they were ironically neutralizing the Soviet ideological machine by using and processing these odious forms of Soviet political agitation and official art. Sots-art in playful and sometimes shocking forms debunks the true meanings and releasing the viewer from ideological stereotypes, because the ordinary population was sort of very frightened with the power and with all its attributes. Anyway, so as you see, despite the fact that Soviet Union was behind the Iron Curtain and that it was closed from all the Western tendencies in art and culture, but still postmodern features, they get inside and penetrate into the Moscow culture of the 1970s, despite everything. So that was kind of a natural process happening all over the world. So first of all, what are the features of postmodern vision? First of all, artists started to view a work of art as a text, as something that can be decrypted, translated from one language to another, even though lexical and visual composition can remain the same, but the meaning will be changing. And what else is important is that Sots-art sought to be an alternative not only to the social realism, but also to the classical dissident modernism. Because these artists, they were not serious about what they are doing. You know that this is also one of the features of postmodern aesthetics, irony and humor. And if dissident artists previously, they were still very serious about what they are doing, Sots artists, they were not. So what I mean, that social realists, they were very serious about what they are doing, and they thought that this is art, what we are doing. Dissident artists and unofficial artists, they've been thinking, well, social realism is not art, and we will produce real art. And that was something different from social realism, and they were also very serious about it. Sots artists, they were not serious, and they thought that every way is possible. You can work in a social realist manner as well. You can work in the language of socialist propaganda if you want to reach your goal. So there is no wrong art or right art. You can choose any art you wish to get to your goal. Finally, the next step, very important for the development of unofficial art and the destiny of unofficial artists, was the so-called Bulldozer Exhibition that took place in 1974. Well, you know, since unofficial art was prohibited and these artists, they had no chance to exhibit it publicly, most of their works was shown in so-called apartment exhibitions. So they were inviting their friends, inviting their colleagues, inviting some guests who arrived to their apartments, and there they've been showing their works of art. But never actually they've done it publicly. And once on 15th September 1974, Komar and Melamid, together with some other prominent unofficial artists like Oscar Rabin, decided to exhibit at an outdoor space. For that, they have chosen some wasteland on the edge of the city that would be too far away to be of interest of the security services, but still that would be easily accessible by those ones who would like to attend. And in fact, it was at some suburbs of Moscow, and the nearest metro station was Belyaevo. At those times, these were suburbs. But nevertheless, the KGB, right, they anyway knew about the show, because at those times, artists who didn't belong to the official union of artists, they were treated with suspicion, and their phones were tapped, and they were under constant surveillance. And that's why they knew anyway about this thing. And despite the minor size of the event, it was considered by the authorities as very serious. And the artists were met with force, and artworks were destroyed by a large group of attackers that included 3 bulldozers. That's why actually it later on started being called as a Bulldozer Exhibition. Water cannons, dump trucks, and hundreds of off-duty policemen. And there were also ordinary people who got orders from KGB to destroy the paintings and beat the artists. But in fact, what is interesting is that all these organizers, they had a very clear idea that they might be in trouble because of that. So they were not idiots, and they realized that this action will attract the attention of the authorities. And that's why we can say this was also a first political action in Soviet Union, because this was kind of performance. So they were not only showing their works of art outside, so it wasn't just a simply exhibition, but at the same time it was sort of provocation from these artists, because they knew that the reaction will be. They knew that the Soviet regime will react on it. So that's what Oscar Rabin told in an interview in 2010. The exhibition was prepared as a political act against the oppressive regime rather than an artistic event. I knew that we would be in trouble. And in fact, it turned out that the organizers, Komar Melamid and Oscar Rabin and many others, they actually invited every foreign correspondent they knew before the exhibition, and all of them turned up, making it one of the most documented events in the history of Russian contemporary art. And the New York Times put the Bulldozer story on their front page, along with some Komar and Melamid paintings. And as a result, these artists woke up the next day to find themselves known all around the world. And after the Bulldozer exhibition, the regime suddenly changed its mind about contemporary art, and official granted permission for the second fall open-air show of paintings in Izmailovsky Park in Moscow on September 29, where more than 10,000 visitors came during the 4 hours of exhibition. And ridiculous, but most of the artists who had participated in the Bulldozer exhibitions 2 weeks earlier were now officially permitted to show their works to the general public. In the decade following these shows, many artists immigrated to Western Europe and the United States, but many also stayed in the Soviet Union. So did Komar and Melamid. They immigrated to Israel and then to New York in 1977. And there, actually, they created one of their most famous series, which was called Nostalgia for Social Realism in 1982-83. So why nostalgia? That's what Alexander Komar was, how he explained it. Nostalgia for the child's naive model of the world, which was implanted into our brains at school when we were taught that we live in the best country in the world, that Stalin is the greatest genius of mankind, father and teacher. This image of Stalin, of course, had nothing to do with the real bloody dictator, but despite the fact that relatives were repressed in our families, I grew up in an atmosphere of idealization and mythologization of Stalin. So you see, they paint a painting in the style of social realism. So they use this language, but they're showing some different subject matter from social realist paintings. They've been saying that, like all Soviet people, they came from Stalin, to whom they have a mixed feeling of love and hate. So these are some other works from the series, also drawn in the style and the language of social realist works, but with other meanings. Stalin with the muses, there in the middle. Barely seen, right? You can look here. There is a bear in the middle, like a symbol of Russia. On the right, there is also a funny painting, but in fact not so funny, because there was nothing funny about it. There was a knock on the door, and the person is hiding underneath the table. Someone's knocking on the door, and he's hiding underneath the table. Well, this work you are probably also aware of. Lenin hails a cab in New York. So they combines already Western images with the Soviet images, and that's an interesting thing that they were talking about. It's very symptomatic to all immigrants that left the USSR, that sweet lie about the world's best country has disappeared, but another mythology has come, that we live in the most terrible country. They were speaking about USSR, and in the West is paradise. And this was also not quite true, as we, the immigrants, now understand. In the world, there is no heaven and hell. The picture of the world is by no means black and white, but with numerous subtle nuances of positive and negative. And the nostalgia of my immigrant generation is more self-irony, self-parody of some simplifications of that time. A lost of clear and fairy tale picture of the world that replaced reality with a mythological fake fairy tale. People like to be deceived by such tales. Actually, many of the artists who were sent out of the USSR, they finally found out that living in the West is also not paradise at all, as they considered while being here. So Komar and Melamid were not the only artists who were working in this postmodernism aesthetics. Another artist that I would like to mention is Leonid Sokov. He also worked with split consciousness and the double think of modern man, no matter political system he belongs. What is interesting about his biography is that in the early 1960s, he was a very famous Soviet sculptor animalist, a specialist in the park sculpture. So in fact, he was provided with orders and, for the parks and public spaces. But despite that fact, since the early 1970s, he decided that he doesn't feel enough space within the official art, and he started doing using his sculptural skills to do works conflicting with the dominant Soviet artistic doctrine. These are just some of them. Glasses for every Soviet person. So he made this object from wood. In fact, it was a metaphor of Soviet man's optics that every one of us need to have such glasses to look through them and to see the reality through them. These are his sculptures, Karl Marx and Mickey Mouse, Dollar and Hammer. This you are probably also aware of famous works, Bear and Monroe, Stalin and Monroe, and the typical postmodernist Leonid Sokov combines in his works not only the symbols of modern civilization as everyday things, signs of power, media persons, but also elements of folklore and classical art. So, and the important character in his works is a bear, as a symbol of Russia. So next, we need to talk about Ilya Kabakov. He is the most well-known abroad Russian artist. Probably you have heard about him because he lives in the United States since the 1980s, and he is, I don't know, maybe now he is even more considered to be an American artist than to be a Russian artist actually, but he was born in 1923 in Dnepropetrovsk, Ukraine, which was USSR at those times. He graduated from the graphic faculty of Surikovsky Art Institute and worked as a children's book illustrator since the mid of 1950s. And he made his first drawings on behalf of artists, not the designer, in the mid-60s. And he was a pure conceptualist in the Western sense. So he wasn't a Sots artist. He was working with the conceptualism, and he was making conceptual art, and there was no irony at all. But still, he worked a lot with Soviet circumstances and culture. This work of art that you see on the screen is called Take Out of the Garbage Can, made in the 1980s. In fact, this is not a painting, this is not a drawing, so Kabakov, as every conceptualist artist, he works with a text. But through this text, he gives some sort of artistic image. One of the favorite Kabakov's lines is the humiliating exposure of Soviet communal life. And actually, it is a schedule of take out of the garbage can. It's a fiction, of course, but he made the schedule of taking out the garbage can in some fictionary apartment somewhere in the country. But why is it a work of art? What is so artistic about it is that he represents life of the Soviet man as a text that is squeezed into a giant table. The people in it, they are no longer of flesh and blood, but citizens who were reduced to lines in some columns, names, surnames, positions, but not real people with real feelings. Later, he develops a special conceptualist genre. These were albums that he showed in a close circle to his guests. Since I've told you that there was no chance to exhibit your works publicly, these were apartment exhibitions, and people were arriving to their apartments, and they've been showing them these albums, which was sort of some kind of performance as well, because they were not only showing these drawings, but so these were not only the drawings themselves, but they were also interpreting and telling about these albums, about these drawings, and these were also some kind of performances. There, Kabakov also speak about fictional characters, like little Soviet people with typical surnames, like here, Flying Komarov in 1981. Which suddenly, in the middle of gray everyday life, open up some other beautiful and magical reality. I would say that it resembles works of René Magritte, probably, or something like that. So we can see influence of late Western modernism in these works. Later, he produced a series of paintings, Holidays, where he pretended to paint as a typical social realist artist. So he showed, first of all, that he can paint the same manner, but at the same time, he decorated these paintings with candy wrappers just to show the distance between real life and official Soviet paintings. And the apotheosis of Soviet art are his total installations, which he is known for. And the most prominent is The Man Who Flew into Space from His Own Apartment. So this was a total installation, but at those time, actually, artists called it environments. There was no such term as installation, and they called it environments. And so they also been doing it inside their own apartments. So it was just like a room that they remade into an object of art inside their own apartments, so where they lived. And in this work, actually, this is a depiction of the misery of life of a small man who managed to build a spacecraft and flew into free and boundless suspense, which actually Kabakov did in 1987. He immigrated to the United States. Kabakov wasn't the only person who actually been creating total installations. Many conceptualists, Moscow artists, they've been doing the same thing. For example, there was such artist as Irina Nakhova, and in the 1980s, she painted all her apartment with black. So everything, all the furniture, all the walls, all the, I don't know, mugs and glasses, they were painted in black. And what she told about it in one of the interviews as well, a desperate need to change this in a situation of total stagnation in the worst years of the Brezhnev era. Nobody hoped for any change. The only thing that I could change in my life was my immediate surroundings, my apartment. So that was what she was working with. On this photo, this is she painting her apartment in black color. And that's one of her latest installations. It was in the Russian Pavilion on Venice Biennale, last Venice Biennale, where again she worked with the color, but this time with red and green as colors of Soviet power, the red one, and the green color is considered to be the color of Perestroika. And at the same time, green color is also important for Russian culture because it's quite often it's the color used in churches. Green is the color of hope. And as well, green is the color of the communist apartments, because the walls in the communist apartments were very often painted in green, in terrible green color. So she works with this as well. The next artist that I need to mention is Eric Bulatov. He is definitely a true genius, and I think there is no way not to like him. I adore this artist. He's great. He actually graduated also from the Zurich Art Institute, and he also, as Kabakov, worked in the children's publishing house. But he is also very known abroad, and he is presented in very many museums abroad, and he is very respected artist abroad that comes from the USSR. In fact, his style of working was very much like in contrast to social artists, to Sots artists, there was no irony in his works as well. That's what he says. Pop art, which at one time had a great influence on me, included a layer of the second reality in my paintings. For Soviet people, this reality was the ideology that owned the entire space of their lives. But I never had irony. I was just trying to express our Soviet consciousness, formed by Soviet ideology. And in this painting, Glory of the KPSS, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the artist called his formula of freedom. So what he meant is that the main thing is not the ideology, but the opportunity to break through this ideology, to break through it to the freedom to the sky. So in this work, Krasikov Street, 1977, he also brings the second layer, where he meant that one layer was ideology and the other layer was real life. You see, he sees a picture as a corridor uniting a picturesque and social space. So on the one hand, we see here Lenin coming from this billboard, and the other layer, people going somewhere else. And do we have a break? So, yeah, we still have time. This work is titled Russian 20th Century, that he made in 1990s. I think it's very powerful, and it shows all history that Russian people were facing in the 20th century. Here we see in the 19th century represented in the architecture, and then the 20th century with its red color, with its blood, with its vibrant and very powerful changes that arrived after the 19th century. Well, in the beginning of the 1980s, foreign press played a crucial role in legitimizing the contemporary art in the Soviet Union. On the one hand, so probably these were the foreign journalists who were writing about it, and that influenced the Soviet authorities to change their mind about it. But at the same time, probably there was something brewing within the regime, a subtle new dissident movement that was slowly but steadily growing until it erupted in Perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and his policies of glasnost, openness, and Perestroika restructuring initiated a transformation that ultimately brought about the dismantling of the Soviet Union. For the artists, these were the lucky times, actually, because they felt that they're standing in front of something new that's going to happen, and that finally they are more or less free to express themselves, and yet they hadn't met this brutal capitalism that they will face in the 90s. So for them it was kind of a happy times. But speaking about ordinary people, of course, these were quite tough times of uncertainty and tension. And for ordinary people, life in the 1980s was hungry and tough. And here I would like to show you some images, typical images of life in what was life in 1980s. You know that USSR was a country of queues, and queues for everything, from sausages to the toilet paper. And in this painting you can see these crowds of people standing in the groceries and trying to buy something. Actually, this is so true because well, I was born in 1986, but I remember these times. I remember my memories of my childhood is me standing with my mother or with my grandmother in these queues in gray shops where nothing actually was on the shelves, but still we were standing in these queues for hours. And as I remember it in my childish memories, this was just like that. So I think that through the lens of art, we can have a better understanding of what it was, because I think it's even more real than from documentaries. So if I was showing you just the photos of these queues, I think it would be less, it will give less feeling of what it was in reality as these paintings. So this is the other painting also about the queues, made in 1986. these cues from monotonous and poorly dressed women that produced a really oppressive impression. They felt hopeless. The next artist that I would like to talk about is Tatiana Nazarenko. So what is interesting about this artist is that she was in a quite unique position, because on the one hand she was quite successful in official art, but at the same time she was highly respected by unofficial artists. So she was somewhere in the middle. And she's also presented in numerous museums all over the world, and her works are in constant expositions of Tretyakov Gallery and Russian State Museum. So this mannequin is in Russian State Museum, actually. This is her self-portrait. And now she's awarded with several government and academic awards, so she's very successful in her career. But still, as she said in one of the interviews, rumor had it that I had a successful career, but that is not entirely true. In 1982, I submitted several works for a show in Hamburg, but I wasn't allowed out of Russia to attend the opening. I was considered to be one of those who should not be permitted to go abroad. So probably authorities were afraid that she might escape. So that's why they forbidden her to go abroad. So I painted this picture as an assertion of my own freedom. All those officials standing below and clapping their hands are applauding my freedom, but in fact I'm locked in, free in my art above the cloud, but not free in fact. I painted all those officials who buried my trip and who buried me from other things. So you see, it's called Circus Actress, and it's also self-portrait. She painted her above the crowd of officials or authorities who are actually applauding her, but in fact not quite sincere about her. I think that this self-portrait is also about the same topic. So she depicts herself lying on a table and all the authorities sitting around. On the one hand, these are people, but on the other hand, these are beasts. And do you recognize this person? This is actually me. So I decided to show you that she made my portrait as well. So I know her and we are friends with her. And I'm very happy that she made this portrait of me in her own style. So she drew me in her own manner, and that's of a great value for me. Here are also the works of the 1980s of her, where she shows the contrast between the storefronts of the shops with beautiful dresses and charming gentlemen and real life people standing in front of it, drinking some beer and poorly dressed, and had nothing to do with these elegant guys. And I also want to show you, since I was asked not to tell you only about the paintings, not only about art, but also about some other culture, I also want to show you some episode from the movie Inter Девочка. It was screened in 1989. And it was extremely popular among Soviet people. There were 41 million viewers, and it was very popular because it's telling a story about an ordinary girl who is working as a nurse in a hospital, but in fact she is a prostitute that is dealing with foreign visitors, foreign tourists to the Soviet Union, and through this she has a opportunity to get some US dollars, to get some dresses, to get some bright life, as she thought she is going to have. And later she marries a foreign visitor from Sweden, and she escapes with him to Sweden, where she starts having everything she was only dreaming about, like cabrio cars and a house and all these clothes and everything. But then she realized that she's still not happy with all these things, and at the same time the Soviet Union collapsed, and she realized that probably she better stayed in the Soviet Union, because now in Soviet Union there is also everything, but she already started being, like on the wrong way. I found this movie with English subtitles, and we can watch if we have internet here. I guess there should be.
Did any of you guys watch this one yet? Yeah.
Well, I saw that you are planning to watch Brat and Jmurki, but I think that you don't have Intergirl on the list.
They have a separate list. I will send you.
I can also give you the link with English subtitles.
Ножки побереги.
So her mother thinks that she works in a hospital at night, but in fact she arrived in the early morning and she is now going to change her clothes.
Я выхожу замуж. Слава Богу. За кого? За Эдика. За инженера Эдварда Ларса. Как же мы тут все поместимся? Я буду жить у него. У него своя комната. Квартира. Где? В Швеции. Боже мой. А я? А что ты видела в этой жизни? Папочку кабеля, зарплату 140, вот этот вот однокомнатный кооператив, вот это вот жизнь. Почему? Почему ты бросила институт? 5 лет учиться, чтобы 100 рублей зарабатывать. Да пошел твой институт, знаешь куда? Тебе много дал твой институт? Да, много. Я детей воспитываю и учу. Мамочка, милая, это они тебя воспитывают и учат. А я хочу свой дом, свою машину. Я хочу зайти в магазин и купить ту шмотку, которая мне нужна, понимаешь? А не бегать за фарцовщиками. Я хочу увидеть мир своими глазами. Ну, не получилось из меня. Ни Софьи Ковалевской, ни Эдит Терешковой. Мам, у меня есть большее, поверь мне. Я женщина или где? Или кто? Или что? Ну ты хоть любишь его? Ну, мам, ну не смеши ты меня. Если надо будет, полюблю. Танька, доченька, ну это же значит торговать собой. Правильно. Правильно, мам. А кто сейчас не торгует собой? Кто не стремится продать свою профессию подороже? Архитекторы, вот ученые, адвокаты. Ты-то тут при чем? А я что, хуже, что ли? Мам, ну не расстраивайся. Мамочка, ну все будет хорошо, я к тебе буду приезжать. Сиди, сиди, это я.
So this was one of the episodes. So now I want to give you a few sketches of what was life like in the 80s during the Perestroika time. And we will talk about Semeyon Faibisovich. This is also one of the most expensive contemporary Russian artists. In 1976, he began exhibiting graphics and then paintings in the basements of Malaya Gruzinskaya Street, where unofficial art was shown. And there, in 1985, they attracted attention of deal makers from New York, and he also he had several exhibitions in New York and abroad. And in 1995, he exchanged art with the literature. But now he returned back to it. But in fact, I think that his best works were done in the 1980s. Art critic Evgeny Barabanov points out that Paul Klee was convinced that the task of a painter is not to portray the visible, but to make visible. And for Faibisovich, seeing and making visible means to make use of subject matter that has been excluded from the contemporary field of vision and the contemporary aesthetic experience because of their all-devouring triviality, ordinariness, and banality. So some of the people might consider him to be a photorealist, but in fact he is not, because he was actually giving something more than just depicting the reality as it was. Since I am editor-in-chief of one website about arts and culture, online magazine, I've been making interviews with him as well, and he told me that it's not about specific subjects, but when a certain feeling is born that you want to convey. When I began to take photographs, they turned out to be terribly disappointing to him. I didn't see in them that feeling that I had. And later on the basis of these photos, I began to see pictures in my head that, although they took the photo as a basis, they were actually different. Photos gave me credibility, and then I connect them with the feeling that I wanted the viewer to have. So this is also a portrait of generation of those time. This is a portrait of a famous poet, Lev Rubinstein, from the cycle Moscow Metro. Actually, his most prominent cycles were the cycles in the metro, cycle in the commute train, and cycle in the bus. So he was making photos of people in these spaces and then making pictures of it. That was quite unusual, because most of the artists, they would not draw this, because well, it seemed that there is nothing interesting in it and nothing special. But that is why this is of a great value for us nowadays, because it can give us a feeling of lifestyles of those times. These are all oil on canvas. So these are all canvases. These works convey a general moral state, tension, uncertainty of ordinary citizens of the USSR during Perestroika. This is the work Stranger from the Shuttle Bus. Well, I would say to you that this girl is quite well dressed, actually, for those times. Also some portraits of young people and grown-ups made in 1985. Again, a work devoted to the cues, line for sausage. Well, it's exactly like from my memories. I think that I've been standing in some kind of a same environment. On the left, you can see it on the left. And on the right, there is a diptych that is called Family Portrait in an Interior. That's one of my husband's favorite works of art. He's always laughing about this painting. So on the left, we see probably a wife and a child doing the things, and on the right, this is also a self-portrait of Semeyon Faibisovich, so I recognize this as him at those times. And he's sitting in the restroom with such a face palm about what is happening around. So that's really a portrait of a passing Soviet era. I truly remember it all like this. So it's somewhere, people waiting for the commute train. This is the work of the 1990s in the train. These are quite huge canvases, by the way, so is 2 meters on the high side, and it's all on canvas. Also, the other one from the series, the commute train. If any one of you have heard about the book Москва петушки, have you? Москва петушки? Yes, Ерефеев. I adore this book. I think it's really great, and probably I would recommend you to read this because it can give a lot of stories about Soviet life of those time. Well, many people, they don't like this book because they think that it is about alcoholism, but in fact alcoholism is just the upper layer in this book, and there are if you can go deeper and you can see many other layers inside this book, as in every work of art actually. And it's also written in the postmodern aesthetics, and there is a contrast between alcoholism on the one side and the main hero, who is a highly intellectual, who is very educated and who speaks perfect intellectual Russian language and who read a lot of books, but at the same time he is an alcoholic like a bum, you know. And this contrast is sometimes quite funny, but at the same time quite sad. So I wanted to read a short quote from this book because I think it depicts the situation that is shown in this painting. But what are the eyes of my people? They are constantly bulging, but no tension in them. The complete absence of any meaning. But what the power! These eyes will never sell you out. In fact, they will not sell anything, and they will not buy anything. Whatever happened to my country in days of doubt, in the time of painful meditations and disasters, these eyes do not blink. Everything for them is a God's due. He wrote this Москва петушки in 1970s, and this is the painting of the 1990s, but I think that slightly has changed actually. And even now, if you go to the commute train that is going from Kursky Vokzal to somewhere in the suburbs, to Petushki, for example, I think you will meet the same image and the same people sitting there, because not so many things have changed, which is weird, but it is. That's the other work. What time is it? It's about the last demonstration, communist demonstration. He drew it in 1989. We can see it. I think it's Tverskaya Street, or maybe it's the Sadovaya Ring, somewhere in the center of Moscow. From 1987, his paintings began to be widely exhibited, and as well in the United States and in Western Europe. And he's also known for making a portrait of Gorbachev for the cover of the Time magazine in 1989. Will you tell me when we have a break? It is? Ah, okay. For 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.